December 17, 1944, 07:15 hours. A frozen road outside Bulge in Belgium. The air is thin and crystalline, so cold it feels like breathing microscopic shards of glass. Inside the cramped turret of a Panther tank, the biting chill seeps through the thick steel, through the worn wool of his uniform, and settles deep into the bones of SS Unterscharführer Klaus Richter. Every exhale is a plume of white vapor that vanishes into the gloom. He's 22 years old, but the endless forests of the Ardennes and the ghosts of the Eastern Front have carved the lines of a much older man onto his face. His fingers, numb inside their gloves, trace the edge of a photograph he keeps tucked in his breast pocket. It's a picture of his wife, Anja, and their 2-year-old daughter, Liesel, taken in Berlin a lifetime ago, a city now being systematically erased from the sky. This offensive Wacht am Rhein is for them. It is the final glorious roll of the dice to push the Allies back, to silence the guns in the West, and to give people like Anja and Liesel a chance at surviving the winter. It has to work. Below him, the 700-horsepower Maybach engine rumbles, a hungry beast consuming fuel at a terrifying rate. The needle on the fuel gauge hovers just above empty. It has been doing so for the last hour. Every lurch forward, every revolution of the tracks feels like it could be the last. Their commander, the legendary SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, has promised them fuel. He has promised them a swift, sharp victory. And the men of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored spearhead of the entire 6th Panzer Army, believe him. They have to. Through his periscope, Richter scans the landscape. Ghostly pines draped in snow. A pale, indifferent dawn breaking over the hills. And ahead, the small Belgian town of Bullingen. It is an objective on a map, a place said to hold a small American supply depot. To High Command, it is a tactical stepping stone on the path to the Meuse River. To Klaus Richter and the thousands of men in the column of steel stretching for miles behind him, it is not a town. It is salvation. It is gasoline. He can feel the tension coiling through the crew. The loader shifts his weight. The gunner's breath fogs the optics. They are a single 5-man organism welded into 45 tons of German steel, running on fumes and the fading promise of a miracle. The attack is about to begin. They will smash the unsuspecting Americans. They will seize their fuel. They will drive on to Antwerp. But as the Panther begins to crawl forward, a cold thought, colder than the Ardennes air itself, lodges in Richter's mind. What will they find in that town? And what will it tell them about the enemy they are fighting? The answer, he will soon discover, is far more terrifying than any American soldier or tank. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, was a plan born of desperation and delusion. By late 1944, the Third Reich was being crushed between two fronts. In the east, the Red Army was an unstoppable behemoth chewing through the plains of Poland. In the west, the Allies had broken out of Normandy and were now poised on the very borders of Germany, massing for the final invasion. German industry was being pounded into dust by relentless bombing campaigns, and the Wehrmacht was hemorrhaging men and material it could no longer replace. In this climate of impending doom, Adolf Hitler conceived one last monumental gamble. He would secretly assemble Germany's last strategic reserves, elite panzer divisions refitted with the best equipment still available, and hurl them through the Ardennes forest, a sector the Allies considered quiet and thinly defended. The plan was a chilling echo of the 1940 blitzkrieg that had shattered France. The objective was audacious: to punch through the American lines, cross the Meuse River, and seize the vital port of Antwerp. This, Hitler believed, would split the British and American armies, encircling and destroying nearly a quarter of the Allied forces in Europe. He gambled that such a catastrophic defeat would force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing him to turn all his remaining strength against the Soviets. The linchpin of this entire operation was the 6th Panzer Army, commanded by the formidable SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, and the very tip of its spear was Kampfgruppe Peiper, a powerful combined arms battle group formed from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, commanded by the 29-year-old SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper. It was a force of nearly 5,000 men and over 100 armored fighting vehicles. Peiper was the archetype of the Nazi ideal: young, handsome, ruthless, and fanatically loyal, with a Knight's Cross with oak leaves earned on the brutal Eastern Front. He was known for his speed, aggression, and a complete disregard for the conventional rules of engagement. His Kampfgruppe was a microcosm of Germany's late-war military might and its fatal weaknesses. It fielded the most feared tanks of the war, the monstrous 70-ton Panzer VI Ausf B, the King Tiger, whose 80-10mm KWK-43 gun could kill any Allied tank from over a mile away. It had dozens of the superb Panzer V Panther tanks, arguably the best all-around tank of the war, and a complement of Panzer IVs and self-propelled guns. Supporting them were Panzer Grenadiers, elite infantry mounted in Sidkayov 251 half-tracks, armed with the revolutionary Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle. On paper, it was an unstoppable force, but it had a fatal flaw, an Achilles heel that defined the entire German offensive: fuel. The King Tiger consumed nearly 4 gallons of gasoline to travel a single mile. The Panther wasn't much better. German industry, starved of oil, could only provide the 6th Panzer Army with enough fuel for roughly 1/3 of the journey to Antwerp. The rest, according to the plan, had to be captured from the Americans. The entire success of Hitler's grand gamble rested not on the power of his tanks or the fanaticism of his soldiers, but on their ability to find and seize Allied fuel depots along their designated route. Codenamed Rollbahn die Kampfgruppe Piper was not just a spearhead. It was a thirsty behemoth, and its primary mission, beyond breaking lines and sowing terror, was to hunt for gasoline. For the men of the Kampfgruppe, the days leading up to the offensive were a blur of secrecy and anticipation. They were told this was the Entscheidungsschlacht, the decisive battle that would change the course of the war. They were issued new equipment, or at least the best equipment Germany could still produce. Some received warm winter gear. Many did not. They were fed rousing speeches about destiny and duty. But beneath the veneer of manufactured bravado, a quiet anxiety gnawed at them. Inside the steel hull of his Panther, Unterscharführer Klaus Richter felt it keenly. The cold was a physical presence, a constant enemy. At night, the crews would run their engines for 10 minutes every hour, just to keep the machinery from freezing solid and to generate a fleeting, precious warmth. Sleep was a luxury, snatched in brief, shivering intervals. Their diet consisted of hard bread and thin soup, a stark contrast to the rich rations they remembered from the early years of the war. The waiting was the worst part. Huddled in the dense, snow-laden forests of the Eifel, hidden from Allied reconnaissance planes, they felt a profound sense of isolation. They were veterans, most of them. They had seen the vast frozen plains of Russia. They had witnessed firsthand the overwhelming material superiority of the Red Army. They had learned that courage and ideology were often no match for an endless supply of T-34 tanks and Katyusha rockets. They hoped the Americans would be different. They were told the Americans were soft, spoiled, and lacked the will to fight. They clung to this belief because the alternative was too bleak to consider. Richter's thoughts often drifted back to his training. He was a master of his craft. He knew every bolt and weld on his Panther. He could gauge the range to a target with uncanny accuracy. His commands to the gunner crisp and immediate. The tank was an extension of his will, a steel predator that he commanded with lethal efficiency. He and his crew were a family, bonded by shared fear and the unspoken trust that each man would do his duty. But all their skill, all their experience was rendered meaningless by the simple, immutable fact of their dwindling fuel supply. The fuel gauge became an object of obsessive focus. It was more important than the ammunition count, more critical than the radio. It dictated their pace, their tactics, their very survival. The plan to capture enemy fuel was repeated down the chain of command until it became a mantra, a prayer. It was a simple, elegant solution on paper, but Richter, who had seen countless well-laid plans disintegrate into chaos on the battlefield, harbored a sliver of doubt. An army that has to rely on its enemy for the means to fight is an army that is already walking a tightrope over an abyss. As the order finally came to move out on the dawn of December 16th, the rumble of hundreds of engines was not just the sound of an army going to war. It was the sound of 1,000 clocks, all ticking down. On the other side of the line, in the idyllic rolling hills of the Ardennes, the American GI believed the war was all but won. For months, this had been the ghost front, a quiet sector where green divisions were sent to get their first taste of combat, and veteran units were sent to rest and refit after the brutal campaigns in France and Holland. The prevailing wisdom among Allied intelligence, from chef headquarters down to the platoon level, was that the German army was a spent force, incapable of mounting any significant offensive operations. The town of Billingen, Belgium, was squarely in the rear area of the USV Corps. It served as a rest and recreation center and a minor logistics hub for the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions. For someone like Corporal James Miller, a supply clerk with a quartermaster company, Life was routine, almost peaceful. His days were spent managing inventory, counting crates of sea rations, cases of Coca-Cola, cartons of Lucky Strike cigarettes, and, most importantly, supervising the endless stacks of 5-gallon jerry cans and 55-gallon drums of gasoline. The sheer volume of material was staggering. To Miller and his comrades, supplies were like the air they breathed, infinite and taken for granted. Trucks arrived daily from the massive depots around Liège and Spa, unloading a river of materiel that represented the awesome power of American industry. They had so much gasoline that spills and wastage were a common annoyance, not a strategic concern. The idea that their fuel could be a primary objective for a German attack was absurd. Intelligence reports in the preceding days had noted some German troop movements, but these were dismissed as preparations for a defensive spoiling attack, or perhaps the formation of a new Volksgrenadier division. The weather was terrible, with low clouds, thick fog, and freezing rain grounding the Allied air forces, which had for months been the undisputed masters of the sky. It was miserable, but it also reinforced the sense of security. The Germans wouldn't attack in this weather, not here. On the night of December 16th, distant rumbles were heard to the east. Most GIs dismissed it as outgoing artillery or thunder. Even as reports began to trickle in of a major German artillery barrage and infantry assaults along the Schnee-Eifel, the news was slow to travel and even slower to be believed. In Bullingen, men slept soundly in their bedrolls, dreaming of hot meals and Christmas packages from home. Corporal Miller finished his paperwork, had a cup of hot coffee, and thought about the letter he was writing to his sweetheart in Ohio. He told her not to worry, that he was safe, and that with any luck he'd be home by next year. The war felt very far away. He had no idea that a 25-mile-long column of German armor was at that very moment grinding its way through the darkness, and that his sleepy supply depot was directly in its path. The American expectation was for a quiet winter. The reality would be a nightmare. The German assault began with a thunderous artillery barrage at 05:30 on December 16th. But for Kampfgruppe Piper, the real battle started when they began to move. Their route took them through the Losheim Gap, a narrow corridor where American resistance was supposed to be swiftly brushed aside. But stubborn pockets of GIs from the 99th Infantry Division and the 14th Cavalry Group fought back with a tenacity that belied their inexperience, creating massive traffic jams and delaying Piper's timetable. Frustration mounted. Every hour wasted was precious fuel burned. Piper, riding near the front of the column, was furious. By the morning of December 17th, the Kampfgruppe was hours behind schedule and dangerously low on fuel. Billingen was no longer just an objective. It was a necessity. Piper made a crucial decision. Instead of following his prescribed route, he swung his column north, taking a shortcut towards the town, hoping to catch the Americans completely by surprise. The attack on Billingen was a textbook example of German blitzkrieg tactics against a soft target. The lead elements, a Panther tank and a squad of Panzer Grenadiers in a half-track, roared into the town's outskirts shortly after 07's Hotzauer. The few American soldiers stationed there were from rear echelon units, service troops and clerks who were in the middle of their morning coffee. The sight of a German tank appearing out of the mist was surreal, impossible. Panic erupted. A few brave men grabbed their M1 rifles and bazookas and tried to mount a defense, but they were hopelessly outmatched. The Panther's 75mm cannon fired a high-explosive shell into a building being used as a command post, the explosion ripping the facade from the structure. Its coaxial machine gun raked the street, spitting tracers that sent men diving for cover that wasn't there. More tanks and half-tracks poured into the town, their engines a deafening roar that drowned out the screams and sporadic rifle fire. Corporal Miller was jolted from his work by the sound of the explosion. He ran outside to see the impossible. A column of German tanks, their menacing long barrels swiveling, advancing down the main road. Men were running everywhere. There was no organized defense. It was a rout. The Germans swept through the town with ruthless efficiency. They weren't interested in a protracted fight. They were hunting for the supply depot. Following directions forced from a captured American, they located the quartermaster depot on the edge of town. There, the resistance was non-existent. Supply clerks and cooks are not trained to fight king tigers. For Unterscharführer Klaus Richter and his crew, it was a moment of supreme relief. His Panther rolled to a halt amid stacks of supplies that towered over the tank itself. Panzer Grenadiers leaped from their half-tracks, fanning out to secure the perimeter, their STG-44s barking in short, controlled bursts. The Americans, those who hadn't fled, surrendered immediately, their hands raised high, their faces a mask of shock and disbelief. The Germans swarmed the depot like starving men at a feast. They found what they were looking for: thousands upon thousands of gallons of gasoline, neatly stored in 5-gallon jerry cans. Ironically, a German invention. A human chain was formed. Cans were passed from man to man and poured directly into the thirsty tanks. The air grew thick with the fumes of high-octane fuel. For a brief, shining moment, it was a stunning victory. They had done it. They had broken through, surprised the enemy, and captured the lifeblood they so desperately needed. The road to the Meuse seemed open once more. As the fuel gurgled into the tanks of his Kampfgruppe, Joachim Peiper stood amidst the captured depot, a lit cigarette in his hand, observing the scene with a practiced, critical eye. The tactical success was undeniable. He had secured roughly 50,000 US gallons of fuel, enough to get his armored behemoths another 60 or 70 miles down the road. His men were jubilant. They were not only refueling their vehicles, they were looting the depot with childlike glee. But Peiper saw something else, and what he saw chilled him to the bone. It wasn't just the fuel. It was everything else. He walked past pyramids of 55-gallon drums, past jerry cans stacked 10 feet high. He saw crates of K-rations piled in mounds the size of small houses. He saw boxes of new winter boots, greatcoats, and woolen blankets. There were pallets loaded with cartons of Lucky Strike, Camel, and Chesterfield cigarettes. There were cases of Hershey's chocolate bars, chewing gum, and tins of Nescafe instant coffee. He saw stacks of new tires for every conceivable type of vehicle, from Jeeps to 2.5-ton trucks. He saw spare parts, tools, and medical supplies in quantities that defied belief. This wasn't a strategic reserve. This wasn't a primary army-level supply dump. This was a divisional rear area depot. This was the logistical overflow for just 2 American divisions in a quiet sector. This incredible, inexhaustible mountain of wealth was considered, by the enemy, to be a small, forward, and ultimately expendable cache of supplies. A cold, hard realization began to dawn on Peiper, an experienced officer who understood the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. For his own 6th Panzer Army, this amount of material would have been a godsend, a strategic asset to be hoarded and carefully distributed. For the Americans, it was little more than a gas station and a convenience store. Unterscharführer Richter experienced the same sickening epiphany on a more personal level. As his Panther was being refueled, a young Panzer Grenadier tossed him a bar of Hershey's chocolate. Richter unwrapped it. It was rich, sweet, and utterly alien. He hadn't tasted real chocolate in years. He looked at the American prisoners being herded into a group. They were young, their faces clean-shaven despite the battle. Their uniforms were clean, their boots new and waterproof. They looked well-fed, healthy. They looked annoyed and scared, but not starved. They were not desperate. Richter then looked at his own men. They were hard, battle-proven veterans. But their faces were gaunt, their uniforms a patchwork of worn and mended fabric. They were grabbing the American rations with a desperate hunger. The victory felt hollow. The cheers died in their throats. They had just captured a treasure trove, but the very existence of that treasure was a testament to a truth they could no longer ignore. They were not fighting the American army. They were fighting the American factory. They were fighting General Motors, Ford, U.S. Steel, and the endless churning production lines of a nation that could produce more in a day than Germany could in a month. Every can of gasoline they poured into their tanks was a drop in the ocean of the enemy's supply. Every captured rifle was one of millions. This was the unexpected outcome at Billingen. The moment of triumph was simultaneously a moment of profound, soul-crushing revelation. The captured fuel was a poisoned chalice. It would allow them to continue their advance, but it had also shown them in undeniable, tangible terms that their advance was ultimately hopeless. They could win this battle and the next, but they had already lost the war of logistics, the war of production, the war that truly mattered. The psychological impact of the Billingen depot rippled through the Kampfgruppe, subtly at first, then with crushing weight. The initial elation of the easy victory and the captured fuel evaporated in the cold Ardennes air, replaced by a quiet, gnawing sense of futility. For the veteran officers like Peiper, the implications were immediate and stark. They were professional soldiers who understood that logistics are the sinews of war. They had spent years on the Eastern Front, constantly hampered by shortages of everything: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and even basic winter clothing. They had learned to make do, to improvise, to achieve incredible tactical victories with a fraction of the resources their enemies possessed. But this was different. This was not a matter of the enemy having more. It was a matter of the enemy having everything, in abundance to the point of casual wastefulness. The sight of the depot shattered the carefully constructed narrative of American weakness and decadence. How could an army be soft when it was supported by such an inexhaustible industrial base? This realization spread to the non-commissioned officers, the hardened backbone of the German military. Men like Klaus Richter, who translated the strategic reality into battlefield experience. As he sat in his refueled Panther, watching his crewmen smoke American cigarettes, he felt a strange sense of detachment. The offensive suddenly seemed less like a glorious charge to victory and more like a desperate death ride. Their faith in their superior weaponry, in their King Tigers and Panthers, was shaken. What good was a superior tank if it was tethered by its own fuel consumption, constantly having to hunt for the gasoline that the enemy treated like water? The morale of the common Panzer Grenadier was affected in a more visceral way. They were overjoyed with the captured food and luxuries. For a moment they could forget the gnawing hunger and the biting cold. But as they ate the rich American food and smoked the smooth American cigarettes, a seed of doubt was planted. They saw the quality of the American equipment, the warm boots, the sturdy uniforms, the well-maintained vehicles. They compared it to their own threadbare kit, the propaganda they had been fed for years, of a fragile, consumerist America that would collapse at the first hard push, rang hollow. The very goods they were now enjoying were proof that the propaganda was a lie. This psychological blow was, in many ways, more damaging than any battle. It replaced fighting spirit with a cold, rational understanding of their own doom. It introduced a fatalistic resignation into the mindset of the Kampfgruppe. They would continue to fight. They would obey their orders. They were, after all, elite SS soldiers, conditioned for fanaticism and obedience. They would advance from Bullingen, and they would inflict terrible casualties on the Americans. But the fire in their hearts, the belief in the ultimate victory of the Reich, had been extinguished. It was drowned in a river of captured American gasoline and smothered by a mountain of Hershey's chocolate. From this point forward, they fought not for victory, but for survival, driven by a grim professionalism devoid of hope. Buoyed by the captured fuel, Kampfgruppe Piper roared out of Bullingen and continued its rampage deep into the American lines. For the next 48 hours, they were a specter of terror, overrunning command posts, ambushing convoys, and brushing aside the piecemeal resistance thrown in their path. They advanced through Stavelot, creating chaos and leaving a trail of destruction, their eyes still fixed on the bridges. Over the Meuse River, the name Piper became a word of dread whispered by panicked American commanders. But the psychological wound inflicted at Bullingen was a portent of the strategic reality that would soon ensnare them. The American army, though caught by surprise, did not break. It bent, it bled, but it did not shatter. And its greatest strength was not in its frontline units, but in its ability to react and adapt. Engineers, the unsung heroes of the Ardennes, became Piper's true nemesis. At the crucial bridge over the Amblève River at Trois Ponts, men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion arrived just ahead of Piper's vanguard and blew the bridge, forcing the German column into a bottleneck. The American logistical tail, which had seemed a weakness, now became a weapon. While Piper was trapped, desperately seeking another crossing, the U.S. command was already moving powerful reinforcements. The 30th Infantry Division moved to block him from the north. The elite 82nd Airborne Division was rushed to the area, setting up a defensive line that sealed his route of advance. And crucially, the weather began to clear. Allied P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, appeared in the skies, turning the roads into a shooting gallery for the trapped German vehicles. Kampfgruppe Piper was cornered in the village of La Glaise. The fuel captured at Bullingen was long gone. Ammunition was low. Food was scarce. The hunters had become the hunted. For days, they held out against relentless American attacks, but their situation was hopeless. On December 23rd, Piper received the order to break out. He was forced to make a heart-wrenching decision: abandon all his heavy equipment. The aftermath was a graveyard of Germany's finest armor. Over 80 armored vehicles, including the prized King Tigers and Panthers, were left behind, destroyed by their own crews to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Piper led the remaining 800 of his original 5,000 men on a grueling trek on foot, through snow and ice, back to the German lines. The mighty armored spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army had been broken, not by a single decisive tank battle, but by a combination of stubborn American resistance, blown bridges, and its own insatiable thirst for fuel. The broader impact was profound. The failure of Kampfgruppe Piper, To seize the Meuse bridges ensured the failure of the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month, a brutal, bloody slugging match that would cost both sides dearly. But the strategic gamble had been lost in those first few days. In the end, the story of Kampfgruppe Peiper is a microcosm of the fall of the Third Reich. It is a story of incredible tactical prowess and operational blindness, of fanatical courage and logistical suicide. The turning point was not on a battlefield, but in a quiet supply depot in Billingen. There, for a fleeting moment, a German colonel and his men captured the means to continue their fight. But in the process, they saw the overwhelming, soul-crushing evidence of why their cause was already lost. The silent, snow-covered husks of King Tigers left behind at La Glaise were not just disabled tanks. They were monuments to an army that had been defeated by the sheer mundane power of the American factory, long before the final shot was ever fired.